The world we live in is full of things we don't understand. Being the curious humans that we are, we naturally try to seek these things out. Doing so has led us to remarkable discoveries and inventions that we never could have imagined 100 years ago. We've defeated disease, built the sky itself, and created machines that could take us beyond the clouds and the stars. If our ancestors could see us and what we've created, I'm sure many of them would see us as gods. Our innate curiosity and lust for knowledge have not always led us to greatness, however. True evil and darkness have also been uncovered in humanity's conquest of knowledge. In the end, I fear this evil will be our doom. I don't say this from the standpoint of a great philosopher who simply pondered things. No, I say this because I've seen it. I've experienced it. I was a part of it. The event I am about to relate to you is true in its entirety. This I swear. I feel certain that this will fall on deaf ears, and many of you will believe this to be just another spooky story meant to give you cheap thrills. But I promise you that this is neither my intent nor my purpose. The purpose of the story is to simply warn you of what lurks beyond the veil of what we can see and understand, to show you what awaits us in the darkness, even if I myself don't understand it. What I'm about to tell you has happened, and I feel certain it will happen again. In 1971, a not-so-well-known scientist began preparations for an extremely secretive project known simply as the Harbinger experiment. I'd like to keep the identity of the scientist a secret for personal reasons, so throughout this account, I'll refer to him as Zimmerman. Zimmerman's background is unclear at best. Beyond 1971, all that's known about him before that time is that he grew up somewhere in Maryland with a strange fascination for the occult and the supernatural. This later made him an outcast among his fellow scientists, due to how scoffed upon the metaphysical was and still is at the time. Zimmerman's views on the otherworldly were not the only reason he was considered an outcast. It was his methods that made him widely unacceptable among his peers. During this time, Zimmerman was notorious for being ruthless and cold beyond measure. He cared little for the means, only the results. If he believed the outcomes would be valuable enough, he would do anything to obtain them. This insatiable and brutal thirst for truth made him feared among those who knew him. Yet a few who were aware of him did not fear him. Instead, they believed in him and closely followed his work. The word Harbinger itself carries a mysterious and intimidating connotation. Perhaps it's the way it rolls off the tongue, or maybe it's due to its association with the project, but the term always seems to evoke a sense of impending doom. This makes sense, as the word means to warn or forebode. I can only speculate on Zimmerman's reasons for choosing this title for the experiment, but in retrospect, it fits perfectly. Zimmerman approached a select few of us, myself included, and informed us that he was working on something significant. He needed individuals who could maintain confidentiality and refrain from gossiping about his work. While he did not fully trust some of us, he recognized that we were professionals, and for various reasons, we were all in dire need of employment. I had worked at a local clinic as a doctor, but was fired for stealing medication, leaving a dark mark on my resume, making it hard to find work. Being a native Alaskan and living near where the experiment would take place made me a convenient choice. As you can imagine, I jumped at the opportunity, especially when I saw the payout. In total, 15 of us were hired. Some were colleagues of his with whom he had been working, while others were maintenance workers or private security. I was the only medical professional on the team. It still amazes me how he managed to secure the funds for the experiment. I wouldn't be surprised if his financing was not entirely legal. But legal or not, I needed the money, and he was paying. Looking back, though, it's a decision I now regret. After obtaining his funds, Zimmerman purchased a relatively large plot of land deep in the frozen wilderness of Alaska. On that land, he constructed a concrete structure not unlike a bunker. The key difference was that this facility was designed to contain potential damage within rather than keep it out. As he explained, most of the structure was buried underground, which made the complex appear much smaller from the outside. Naturally, there was only one way to enter and exit the underground facility, a ladder leading from a small, unassuming concrete building on the surface, which I will refer to as the entrance building for convenience. After everyone had gone to bed at night, the hatch containing the ladder would be sealed with a large, thick metal lid. Zimmerman was very strict about this. Not far from the entrance building was a series of wooden cabins that served as sleeping quarters for the staff Zimmerman had hired. Compared to the entrance building, the underground system was massive. At the center of the complex was the control room, where all the facility's electronics were connected, including security cameras, lights, and door controls. Consoles, monitors, and computers lined the walls of this large central chamber. This is also where the ladder from the entrance building connected. Connected to the control room were 3 doors. One led to a smaller room that served as an infirmary, another to a break room, and the last into the hallways. The hallways of the complex began to feel extremely eerie. For some reason, they were laid out in a confusing scheme that led in circles and to complete dead ends. These hallways comprised a vast majority of the complex, making it easy to get lost in the maze if you were unfamiliar with the layout. However, if you knew where you were going, you would soon find yourself standing before one of 3 8x8 feet rooms. Each room had a camera installed in one corner, and all 3 cameras were connected to corresponding monitors in the control room. Additional cameras were scattered throughout the hallways, allowing anyone watching the monitors to see anywhere they wanted at any time. Thick metal doors stood at the entrance to each of the 3 8x8 feet rooms, and in order to open them, you had to enter a 4-digit code into a panel located near the door. I remember when I first arrived at the complex how frightening those hallways were for me. You see, I have always been claustrophobic, and the hallways were very narrow. The noise, or rather, the lack of noise, was also a significant source of fear. The bleak, narrow corridors were unnaturally silent, as if the entire world had stopped moving, which made me feel trapped down there. Thankfully, I rarely ventured into those hallways, since I was the only medical professional in the facility and had virtually no reason to go into them. At first, I found it peculiar that Zimmerman would seek a medical professional for a project like this, but by the time it was all over, I understood why. The official purpose of the Harbinger experiment was to test and observe the effects of extended isolation on the human mind, as stated in the reports being sent out. However, unbeknownst to those not participating in the project, except for the subjects, the true purpose was much darker. As I mentioned before, Zimmerman had an obsession with the occult and the supernatural. He sought to prove himself to those who doubted him and wanted physical evidence that the supernatural was real. He aimed to be the first to obtain such proof. The true purpose of the Harbinger experiment was to find evidence of the metaphysical, a world we couldn't see. The thought of this was naturally daunting and even terrifying, but it was Zimmerman's method that was truly chilling. Zimmerman believed he could open a portal between worlds, momentarily allowing 3 random entities to cross over into ours, with each being trapped in one of the 3 rooms. He theorized that an entity would attempt to latch onto the nearest living thing capable of hosting it. He intended to use this technique to trap a spirit in a physical form by allowing it to enter a living being that had been injected with a compound of his own creation. In theory, this compound would prevent the entity from simply leaving its host. It could only escape through death. According to Zimmerman, the host would need to be a living being with a will strong enough to survive the possession. There is only one known species that possesses the amount of will required for this: humans. Zimmerman had also taken measures to ensure that the entities would only enter the 3 rooms and that there would be only one entity in each room, though I can't say I know exactly what he did. In fact, I know next to nothing about how Zimmerman managed to execute his plans. He liked to keep his methodology secret from even his most trusted colleagues, likely due to his paranoia that someone would steal his ideas and take credit for their success. If I had known this was the true purpose of the experiment before I signed up, I might have reconsidered. However, Zimmerman chose not to disclose this information until we were all gathered at his fortress. Even if any of us had wanted to leave, I doubt we would have been able to. The security team Zimmerman had hired was loyal to him, and the payout, it was unlikely that he had given them orders to allow anyone to leave. There were 3 subjects included in the experiment, all native to Alaska. Each was lured into the project under the belief that they would be participating in a harmless study on the effects of isolation on the human mind, which is why none objected when they realized they would be confined to one of the 3 rooms I mentioned earlier. The first subject was a young man who was out of work and desperately needed the money offered for participating. The second was a woman who, by her appearance, seemed to be struggling with addiction. The third and final subject was an older man, a drifter, if I had to guess. One thing they all had in common was that none had any family or friends left. In short, no one would miss them, which is why they were chosen. I apologize for not being able to provide more information about the subjects, but all of this is drawn from memory, and I was given little information about the 3 to begin with. The experiment did not officially begin until 1987, 16 years after its original announcement. I was eager to start, so I packed up and headed to the complex as soon as I could. I arrived at the complex a week before the subjects had even signed up and a whole month before the project began. I was not the first to arrive by any means. When I got there, Zimmerman, his colleagues, and the security team had already arrived. I suppose you could say I was among those who Zimmerman did not trust to arrive first. Everyone had gathered about a week before the experiment began, and I noticed a subtle rift between those who were there for the money, like me, and those who were followers of Zimmerman. On October 15, 1987, all the preparations were in place. The subjects had been sealed in their rooms, the cameras, lights, and speakers were fully operational, and all staff members had settled in. The time had come for the experiment to officially begin. Zimmerman asked everyone to report to the control room around 9 p.m. to witness the start of the experiment. He wanted us all present when he proved that his theories were correct and that he was not just a madman. He wanted us to see the fruits of his labor. When everyone had finally gathered in the large control room, Zimmerman turned to us and simply said, "Observe." He then turned his back to us, leaned into the microphone that would project his voice through the 3 rooms, and began chanting in a strange language that I feel certain no one but Zimmerman could understand. We all watched the 3 large monitors on the wall, silently waiting for something to happen. The subjects stood in their rooms, dumbstruck by Zimmerman's chanting, staring at the monitors with confused expressions on their faces. After about 5 minutes, I felt something awful. I can't explain exactly what it was, but a horrible sense of dread washed over me, riddling me with fear. It was then that the ground began to shake and the lights flickered. Zimmerman continued chanting into the microphone as if nothing were amiss, while the subjects began dashing around in their rooms, screaming for help. Suddenly, the ground stopped shaking, and the monitor images turned to static. The air grew heavy as we stared at the monitors, waiting for them to regain their image and show us what was happening in those 3 rooms. For a while, all was silent, but then there was screaming. The screams of a woman in unbearable pain and terror began to echo through the compound, accompanied by the screams of men that coincided with hers, mixing into an awful symphony of pain and fear that beat mercilessly into our ears. Those of us who were there for the money exchanged scared looks, while those loyal to Zimmerman seemed completely unfazed. We wanted to leave and never return to this awful place. But deep down, we all knew that Zimmerman would never allow that to happen. We were here for the long haul. There was no escape. It was 10:13 p.m. when the screaming finally stopped, and the monitors had yet to reveal what had occurred in those 3 rooms. As soon as the screams ended, Zimmerman stood and dismissed us for the night, adding that we were all forbidden to return to the compound until 10 a.m. the next morning. Not that any of us wanted to. We all solemnly made our way out of the compound and towards the cabins, settling in for the night. I think it's safe to say that not all of us slept well that night, and I was not one of them. The following morning, all the staff had gathered at the entrance building. We stood inside, exchanging tired or nervous glances as we waited for Zimmerman to arrive and open the hatch that concealed the ladder. I could see palpable fear in some of our eyes, while others seemed unaffected by what had happened the night before. Zimmerman showed up 5 minutes after 10, apologizing for his tardiness. As he entered the entrance building, he opened the hatch and, without hesitation, began descending the ladder into the dark abyss. He almost seemed enthusiastic. I was the first to follow him down into the facility. It felt as though the farther I climbed down, the more the darkness closed in on me, as if it were trying to swallow me whole. The deeper I went, the more I sensed that this place was different somehow. While before there had only been unsettling concrete hallways and rooms, now there was something else, something that made the eeriness feel real and personified. It felt as though a horrible and gruesome scene awaited us below, but I continued climbing down despite my fear and hesitation. This was no longer just a spooky bunker. There was darkness and malevolence in the air. A true evil now resided here, and I could feel it. We all could. Finally, my foot touched the ground, and I let out a silent sigh of relief to be on solid ground. Almost as if on cue, the light bulbs flickered to life, flooding the room with their warm and welcome light. Zimmerman must have turned on the power, I thought. I took a moment to examine the control room. It was exactly as we had left it the night before, for which I silently offered a thankful prayer. It was almost as if nothing unusual had ever happened. I shook myself from my thoughts as I remembered the static-filled monitors from the night before. My eyes slowly made their way to the screens on the wall, anticipating the grim and fearful scenes they would reveal. My attention was first drawn to monitors 1 and 3, which were still pure static. While this would have been a small relief, the motionless image on monitor 2 caught my eye. Room 2 was entirely still, and everything seemed untouched. I couldn't help but gasp as I noticed the only thing that was different. The woman lay in the center of the small concrete room, an expression of fear and terror frozen on her gaunt face. She lay silent and lifeless on her back. Zimmerman's expression turned angry when he saw this. He ordered that the second monitor be turned off, and it was. We didn't ask why. It's not like any of us wanted to see the dreadful scene any longer. He also ordered that if the images on monitors 1 and 3 did not return within the next 2 hours, the security team would be sent to investigate the rooms. The security team nodded at hearing this, making it seem as though they had no fear, but I could see it in their eyes. The subtle tick-tock of the clock was the only sound that echoed throughout the control room as I stared at the monitors. An hour and 50 minutes passed, and static was still all that occupied monitors 1 and 3. All the other staff members were working except for me, as the project had been completely injury-free thus far, leaving me with nothing to do but wait for someone to get hurt. Zimmerman, a couple of his colleagues, and I were the only ones occupying the room. They quietly chattered among themselves on the other side, while I spent my time reading and pondering the situation I found myself in. I clearly made a mistake coming here. The corpse lying in room 2 was evidence of this, and God only knew what awaited us in rooms 1 and 3. My thoughts were soon interrupted as the image on monitor 3 returned. The clear display made everyone's eyes noticeably widen. What was shown on the monitor was horrifying. A humanoid figure stood in the center of the room, staring directly at the camera, unmoving. It was wearing the jumpsuit that Subject 3 had issued, but this was clearly not the same man who had entered the room. What caught my attention first were its eyes. They were solid black and twice the size of normal human eyes. They seemed endless and cold. Its head had also grown in a symmetrical and unsettling manner, and it had shed all the hair it once had. Even from the monitor, I could see how unnaturally smooth and clear its skin was. It had also seemingly grown in height and stature, evident in the fact that the jumpsuit was now far too small for its wearer. Its limbs had elongated, with its arms hanging almost as low as the creature's knees. What we were looking at was in no way the same man who had been sent inside. Fear was all I felt as I continued to stare at the thing in the room, and my fear seemed to be shared by those around me, which was oddly reassuring. It may sound awful, but it was somewhat satisfying to see that Zimmerman and his colleagues could feel fear too. At the same time, it was worrying because this indicated that something had gone wrong. This was not part of Zimmerman's plan. We all stared into the monitor at the creature, despite our fears. It was almost as if we were in a trance. My already present fear began to grow and spread rapidly through my body as I became lost in the creature's eyes, trapped in its horrifyingly hypnotic gaze. After what felt like an eternity, I managed to break eye contact with the creature and divert my attention from the monitor. When I did, I felt my fear levels drop considerably. After a short while, Zimmerman ordered his security team to make their way to the subject's door. Just as he said that, the security team left without question, armed only with batons and pistols. I focused my attention on watching the men progress through the hallways towards Subject 1's room via the cameras. Even through the low-quality feeds, it was clear that these men were afraid of what awaited them. Their heads were downcast as they walked. They lacked the confidence they had when the project began. They looked like scared little boys being sent off to a terrible war. Eventually, they made it to the door. We had a clear view of them and the door from the hallway camera. One of them spoke through a walkie-talkie and gestured toward the camera. In response, one of Zimmerman's colleagues buzzed the door open. The men had their pistols drawn by the time the button was pushed. Slowly, the door began to open, and we all watched eagerly as the men approached, guns aimed inside. Suddenly, without warning, there was a loud shriek and something lunged out of the room at the men. The monitor immediately turned to static. We could hear screams echoing down the halls, followed shortly by the distinct sound of gunshots. We could do nothing but wait. After a couple of minutes, the screaming and gunshots stopped. We all waited and prayed, hoping that whatever had lunged at them from the room would not be the one to return to the control room. A few more minutes passed before 3 of the men came back, carrying the corpse of the 4th. He had massive cuts covering his chest, and his face was shredded. You couldn't even tell who he was anymore, or that he had ever been human. I was used to gore, being a doctor and all, so I felt somewhat unfazed by the mass of shredded flesh and bloody meat they carried with them. However, many of the others went pale and vomited. The security team all wore motionless expressions and eyes filled with terror. One of the men finally looked up at us, staring for a while with his wide eyes. "It's dead," he managed to mutter in a shaken voice. A couple of hours went by. The dead man's name was Frank, and he was buried outside in the cold Alaskan ground. 2 of the men were physically unharmed, at least. The 3rd was alive, but barely. His body was covered in bloody slashes, and one of his eyes had been gouged out. I managed to stabilize him, but only just. The other 2 men vaguely explained what had happened. Apparently, Subject 1 had leaped out at Frank as soon as the door opened, but it wasn't really Subject 1 anymore. According to them, It had a hideously contorted face and long, sharp claws. They claimed to have shot it over a dozen times before it finally seemed dead, and then they emptied another dozen bullets into it just to be sure. Only once it was truly dead did they come back. After tending to the wounded men, I went to investigate the monitors. As afraid as I was of seeing what they might hold, I needed to check on Subject 3. He was the only one left now, and I needed to ensure that the creature was still in his room. It seemed more like a jail cell than an ordinary room at this point, which was probably a good thing. The cameras displaying Subject 1's room and the hallway outside it still showed a static-filled screen. No one had been sent to repair them or investigate. We just had to hope that Subject 1 was well and truly dead. Monitor 3's image was exactly as I had left it. Subject 3 was still staring directly into the camera, unmoving. He remained in the exact same position, and if not for the small fan in the corner of the room, I would have thought I was looking at a still image. In a way, I felt relief at seeing this relief that he was still in his room and hadn't escaped while no one was looking. After everything quieted down, I noticed something especially unusual, a strange sound emanating from somewhere. At first, it was barely noticeable. The only reason I heard it was because of how extremely quiet it was in the infirmary. But as time went by, it slowly began to increase in volume. After about an hour, it was loud enough that everyone else could hear it too. A couple of hours later, its volume had increased so much that we could determine what the noise was. It was a song. One of the staff members identified it as "Living in the Sunlight" by Tiny Tim, saying that his father loved this song and listened to it frequently. The song seemed to be on a loop, replaying itself continuously. Although we were able to identify the noise, we remained unable to pinpoint its source. We knew it wasn't coming from the speakers because we had turned them off. It seemed to be emitting from the walls themselves. More time ticked by as we all grew increasingly agitated by the song. I spent most of my time in the infirmary attending to Frank or in the control room. Fear hung in the air, and the unmistakable presence of darkness and evil was undoubtedly its source. Subject 3 still hadn't moved. He kept his unblinking gaze fixed on the camera the entire time. It always felt like he was staring directly at me, no matter where I was in the room. I think this effect was also felt by others, as they seemed to move around the room a lot for seemingly no reason. After a few hours, the song was so loud that people had to shout to communicate. We had been trying to find its source so we could turn it off, but to no avail. The source was completely unidentifiable. This added a level of extreme irritation to our already palpable fear. Around 8:30, the ground began to shake once again, just as it had the previous night. Panic spread among my fellow employees and me as the shaking grew in intensity. During this, I had a sudden instinctual urge to look at Subject 3's monitor, and it was gone. Almost as if on cue, the power went out, and thankfully, the song ceased as well. Ever since the security team returned, panic had been slowly building among the staff, and Zimmerman was powerless to stop it. When the lights went out, the calm demeanor everyone had been trying to maintain vanished, and fear took over our hearts. The emergency backup lights kicked on shortly after the power went out, for which I silently offered a prayer of thanks. The lights were dim, but they still allowed me to see. Total panic seized us as many of our fellow staff members began screaming and rushing to the ladder in an attempt to escape. Too many were trying to use it at once, and no one could get very far on the ladder without someone else pulling them to the floor and taking their place. Zimmerman shouted for everyone to calm down, but his dominating and intimidating presence had no effect here. His demands fell on deaf ears. It was complete chaos. It wasn't long before people actually started hurting each other in a desperate attempt to get up that ladder and out of this place. I could only stand against the wall and wait for my opportunity to escape up the ladder. All the screams were soon silenced as the familiar hum of that unsettling song began to rise in volume again, only much quicker this time. This time, it was clear that the noise was coming directly from the maze-like corridors. People stopped fighting and shouting as their attention shifted to the door that led into the hallways. The song quickly grew louder than it had ever been before, forcing many of us to cup our ears in an attempt to silence the noise. Then, suddenly, the song just completely stopped. Silence filled the room as we all stared at the thick metal door, anticipating what was coming. It felt like ages had passed, but in reality, it was probably only seconds before the silence was broken. The door suddenly and violently burst open, and the music started again, louder than it had ever been before. The abrupt increase in volume caused many of us to recoil, falling to the ground and grabbing our ears to block out the noise. I glanced up for just a second. and in the doorway stood a tall, smooth-skinned figure with long limbs and eyes so dark and malevolent that they were clearly visible in the dim lighting. After I regained my bearings, I looked up at the creature just in time to see it pick up Zimmerman and rip him in half in one fluid motion, dousing the room and everyone in it with his blood, intestines, and organs. I was no stranger to gore, but the sight of that was too much for me to bear. I hunched over immediately after seeing this and vomited all over the cold cement floor. The latter was my only hope for survival, I thought to myself, as I forced myself to a standing position. As my eyes rose along with the rest of me, I could see the creature ripping and tearing through the people as they scattered in an attempt to escape. They were so distracted, and as awful as it sounds, this was my only chance to get up that ladder. I pushed my legs to move toward the ladder, trying to block out the terrified screams of my fellow staff members and the unbearably loud music. I could hear gunshots coinciding with the screams and the horrific sounds of flesh being ripped apart. Amidst the chaos, I reached my hands outward and felt a wave of relief wash over me as my fingers came into contact with the hard metal rungs of the ladder. I gripped them and began to climb upwards as quickly as I could in my disoriented state, all the while praying that the monster would not see me and pull me off the ladder and back into the slaughter. It felt like at any moment I would feel one of its smooth hands wrap around my ankles and pull me to my death, but I eventually made it to the top. There was no question in my mind. I had to close the hatch and seal the thing down there, even if it meant certain death for my colleagues. I couldn't allow that creature to escape. I gripped the thick metal lid and began to push with all my might in an attempt to seal off the underground complex. Despite how dense and sturdy it was, the lid was surprisingly easy to move and didn't take much effort to push over the hatch, even in my weakened state. In seconds, the hatch was completely covered by the heavy metal lid. I collapsed on my side and began to vomit again as exhaustion overtook me. As I lay there, I realized something. Aside from my labored breaths, the only thing I could hear was the faint echo of that song from down below. I felt as though I'd lose more of my sanity if I continued to listen to it, so I forced myself to my feet and began to make my way to the wooden lodge where I had stayed the previous night. That was where I left my baggage and the keys to my truck. Of the 15 staff members who took part in that forsaken experiment, I am the only one who survived. I never returned to the awful place where all of this happened, and I don't intend to. The project was very secretive, and Zimmerman was the only one who knew all the details of it. As far as I know, no one is aware of my involvement aside from me. In fact, I'm probably the only one who knows what the Harbinger experiment truly was, let alone what actually happened. By now, you're probably wondering why I've told you about something none of you should be aware of. Maybe you're expecting me to give you a speech about not messing with things you don't understand, or something along those lines. I hope not, for I don't have a speech to give or a lesson to impart. I began hearing a noise earlier today. Almost immediately, I recognized it as a hauntingly familiar song. I didn't even try to trace it to its source. I knew it would be pointless. As the day progressed, the song increased in volume, loud enough that I could clearly make out the lyrics. I'm completely unable to escape Tiny Tim's voice. It follows me everywhere I go. Subject 3 is coming for me, and I know my time left in this world is extremely limited. Now, I guess you could say that I just wanted to tell the tale of the Harbinger experiment before it was lost forever. I hope that you take some lessons from what I've recounted, but I think we both know that you won't. Let's be honest. You don't believe a word of what I just told you, and I don't blame you. I wouldn't believe me if I were you. To you, this is nothing more than something to get cheap thrills from. You're probably mindlessly surfing the internet, clicking a link, and finding yourself here. Whoever here may be, to be honest, I don't care if you believe me or not. Even if you do, it probably won't stop you from trying to uncover the truth of a darkness that few of us have ever seen. It certainly never stopped Zimmerman. If you want a lesson, look at what happened to him when he went seeking the truth. I pray that none of you will ever discover this truth. I pray that none of you ever have to see the evil that I've seen, and I hope you all get to live in ignorance of what lies beyond the veil of what we can actually understand. It's here now. I can feel its black eyes burning into me, just as I could all those years ago. I am as much to blame as Zimmerman for the monstrosity that's now free to roam the world, even if I was not the one to create it. I'm sorry. Sorry. Please forgive me. Did you enjoy this content? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Support us with a like and subscribe so our channel can reach more people. Thanks for watching until the end.